Bobby Manning here, as promised. Tommy Beer joining us, covering the Knicks on his newsletter. Make sure you go get that. I'm talking to him here for the first time on Dome Theory. And I have a number of Knicks fans in my life. Tommy went to Syracuse, obviously, a ton of people from New York up there. And weirdly enough, there were actually a number of them who weren't Knicks fans. I feel like for people my age, the Knicks have just kind of worn on New York people to the degree where I actually have a friend who's a Nets fan, which is rare enough in New York, and another who's a Thunder fan, which obviously goes back to the Russell Westbrook years, Kevin Durant there as we were growing up, and the Knicks fans still going through hard times. I thought it changed last year. I thought Tom Thibodeau and the things that they were able to accomplish making the playoffs last year would set them off in the right direction. But as we talk here today, they're out of the playoffs.
Yeah, yeah, it takes a rare breed to stay loyal to the Knicks, and for the younger generation, there's a lot more options, etc. I actually went to school up in Massachusetts. I went to Holy Cross, and then I lived out in outside of Boston, North Quincy, for a few years after that. So I got quite a few Celtic fans and Sox fans in my life as well. So. But yeah, as far as the Knicks are concerned, they're in a tough spot right now. Obviously, not the record that they had hoped. 25 plus games into the season. Certainly with expectations as high as they were, disappointing from that perspective. But if you kind of look at the big picture, they are, they were 4 games under 500 at this point last season. As we know, they ended up 10 games over. Can they, kind of get back to that stature? It certainly remains to be seen. They added Derrick Rose at the midpoint last season. That made a huge difference. It's unlikely that they'll add a player of that caliber that can kind of unexpectedly improve the team as much as he did. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Because I think that the kind of the regression from Julius Randle shooting 41% from three last season, and RJ Barrett hasn't taken a step forward. I think those are probably your two primary culprits in terms of the disappointment this season. And the other one, obviously, that we'll discuss is Kemba Walker, who hasn't played as well as certainly Leon Rose and company and Knick fans hoped he would.
So let's go in on Kemba. I think that'll be the large part of the show here. Obviously, he was in Boston last year, had a disappointing season here. Just ton of frustration from the fans over the knee situation. Obviously, something he couldn't control. The load management that Knicks and Tom Thibodeau were kind of laughing off to begin this year, and I'm like, oh, like don't go into this that defiant about what went on in Boston. There was clearly issues with his knee coming into Boston that they had to deal with throughout those 2 seasons. It got worse. They ended up trading him. The Thunder released him without really even trying to trade him, it seemed like, which was another red flag for me. So he ends up in New York on a 2-year, $16 million deal. I felt like a lot of Knicks fans were waving the flag saying this can't go wrong. There's no way this small contract here is going to go wrong. It's all reward, no risk. But he's in the starting lineup opening night, and I was there. It was an electric game. The crowd at MSG was just awesome. There was a lot of good sentiment, not only about his return, but where the team was going into the year. But even on opening night, you just saw it. Kemba, like 40% from the field, struggling defensively, not giving you a ton in terms of creation. That's kind of who he is at this point. And stunningly, somewhere along the line, Tom Thibodeau just pulled the plug completely, and it feels like he's never going to play again, barring any significant changes here. Maybe COVID sneaks him in some minutes here, but Tom is just done with him, I guess.
Yeah, well, so let's. Unfortunately, for the Knicks' perspective, Deuce McBride played really well in the Knicks win Thursday night in Houston. He's out with COVID. Derrick Rose is questionable with an ankle injury for tonight's game against the Celtics. So I actually would be shocked if Kemba didn't play. So
All
I think
right, he's free.
that the kind of all the obstacles in his way have been cleared. Immanuel Quickley also out with COVID, so it was really an opportunity for him to kind of re-enter the rotation, whether that's short term, if he can, get some consistent minutes going forward. So it'll be very interesting interesting to see how well he plays tonight. Obviously, the return to Boston kind of adds a little intrigue, into a little spice into the recipe as well. But yeah, I thought I was one of those folks that thought that it was definitely a wise gamble on the Knicks' part, to bring him in at the contract they did. The point guard has been a major issue for New York, for the better part of the century, honestly. Basically since Stephon Marbury left, it just has been all downhill since then. Actually, since the 2005 season up until today, the player that leads the Knicks in total assists is Carmelo Anthony. So
Wow.
that kind of gives you an idea. And Melo's never been known for his great passing skills, or
And
willing.
Rose has been excellent, but you look at that rotation there, it's 2 guys with bad knees who are aging.
Yeah,
And
Rose has definitely exceeded expectations, since they brought him in.
Yeah.
He's incredibly playing at a really high level. But yeah, Kemba, basically since the start of the season, it was clear, unfortunately, after the first few weeks, first few games, that his knee just hadn't responded. I think the Knicks were hoping, and Kemba was hoping, that that extended time off, over the summer, they kind of kept him out of, extended practices and workouts and stuff once the Knicks brought him in. Obviously, he wasn't the same player that he was in Charlotte, even in Boston, but he did put up good numbers in Boston, averaged around 20 points per game when he was healthy.
He had his moments, even
Yeah,
last year. You know,
yeah.
we host a post-game show here, and I pretty much defended him right up until the end. I thought it was something that they could manage, work around. He hit his stride late in the year,
Mhm.
had a few big 30-point games down the stretch of the season, and then getting to that first-round series against Brooklyn, plays a couple games, and all of a sudden he's out for the series, and it's just like, here we go again, back to square one. And to his credit, he's a guy who is very positive about it, optimistic, and was always kind of taking the bright side on it, which, considering the situation he's going through with it, that's really irreversible, the cartilage damage there. And that's all he can really do aside from just giving in on his career, I'd assume at this point. But at the same time, I don't think he always let on about the pain he was dealing with. He never mentioned it 2 seasons ago. Then he came back and said he was dealing with pain after the bubble. They ultimately had to shut him down for the early part of last year. And it was like, you can delay this, but it's never going away fully.
Yeah, it's unfortunately it's something he's going to have to deal with. So maybe a minimal role on a contender, 15 minutes off the bench here and there. And the good thing, from a offensive standpoint, is he's shooting over 41% from three this year. Was consistently knocking down threes. Was kind of spacing the floor well. But as you
So
noted,
why 0 minutes? Why did it go from that to 0?
sure. I think that the initially Tibbs really wanted to, needed to kind of shock the Knicks system. They were playing really poorly, and Kemba himself. I mentioned he was knocking down the three, but he wasn't, the ability to drive and kind of blow past defenders on the perimeter wasn't there. More importantly and more devastatingly was his negative impact on the defensive end. He just has a really hard time staying in front of any guard with reasonable NBA quickness right now. So they would have to throw doubles at him. He couldn't get under screens. He couldn't get around screens. So bigs would have to cheat and help, to kind of cover up the mistakes. That just kind of the guys, the point guards penetrating into the paint was kind of wreaking havoc on the Knicks defensively. His plus minus was the worst in the NBA at the time of his benching.
And that starting unit, I don't think I've ever seen net rating so bad for a starting lineup.
And they were awful. And a lot of that, certainly not all of it goes on Kemba. Part of it goes to Julius Randle really taking a step back from his whole NBA season. Evan Fournier has not found his stride in New York. We'll see if that can kind of turn around. So a lot of folks were thinking, maybe Fournier should have got benched instead of Kemba. A lot of Knicks fans have defended Kemba and said he's kind of the whipping boy and he kind of took the brunt of the blame. But to answer your question, going from 30 plus, even 25 minutes a night, starters minutes to 0. Again, I think it was kind of just to shock the system. And then Tibbs, you had great success with Rose. He's been the Knicks' most productive and efficient player this season. Immanuel Quickley's been really good. He's had some shooting slumps here and there, but he's a far better defender, certainly on the perimeter than Kemba is. And then you got Miles McBride trying to focus and fight for minutes. He looked really good. Thursday night, 15 points, 9 assists, 0 turnovers. So I think that was the situation. With even if McBride wasn't missing tonight's game because of COVID, I think Kemba would have got back in the rotation if Rose doesn't play. So I think again, I think he'll see minutes tonight. I'm not sure what the situation is going forward, but I think the other situation there was from a Knicks perspective is if we're not going to play him consistent minutes, let's not rush him 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Maybe let's try to keep him healthy and see if we can trade him to a team that can use him. Kind of do what's right for him and the team. Maybe get a second round draft pick back, or a kind of a wing player that can help the Knicks, or a shooter. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But yes, I think we've all been surprised that his minutes have dropped so drastically so quickly.
Yeah, and I think the sense from Boston is told you so, but at the same time, I think everybody's looking at this and saying this is just a bummer. I mean, this could have been such a great story. The applause he got on opening night there, the atmosphere from the fans. He obviously started a meme sensation with the fans outside of the arena on that night. It was just a special regular season game. Obviously, the double overtime too, a thriller the last time these two teams met. This time it's going to be in Boston. Knicks shorthanded, I guess it's what Barrett, Quickley, McBride, Grimes, on and on and on. Number of Celtics missing as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we'll do a COVID show next week. I'm just gonna leave that out the window now before further developments come up. But ultimately, what does this season become for New York in your mind? Because I think on that night, fans were excited to potentially be a home court team again, maybe make a deal mid-season with all these contracts New York has. Damian Lillard's probably the dream for many Knicks fans as he becomes probably more and more available by the day as Portland sinks lower and lower. They still have the contracts to pull it off, but obviously there'll be numerous suitors around the league, Philadelphia among others, who are going to want to pursue him at some point. So that's certainly an option here, consolidating. You got some good young guys. Quentin Grimes with that 27. I love his game. McBride, as you mentioned, playing well. Barrett started the year well and then tailed off. Randall, big extension, struggling immensely this year. And then you got a couple decent centers there. Like, I like the team. I like their style, shooting a ton of threes, playing with that pace on opening night. They were so exciting. And last year, they were one of the best defensive teams in the year in the NBA, built their identity around that. But that's completely disappeared. The inconsistency of this group's astounding. I think Celtics fans who have seen a ton of inconsistency this year would still be shocked to see just how inconsistent this Knicks group is. And like, really, it's shocking to have 10 teams in a playoff picture now and for them to not be in there. Like, what's the season ultimately becoming now? Do they have to get back on their feet and make that push like they did last year, or are they gonna have to shake this up at some point?
Yeah, I think I will have an answer for you 30 days from now. I think
Mhm.
a month. The Knicks are actually entering a really soft portion of the schedule that started Thursday in Houston. Incredibly, they're in the middle of a stretch, or at the beginning of a stretch, where they play 14 teams. None of the teams they play have a winning record. A few teams like the Celtics are 500. A couple other squads in there are currently 500. But as of this moment, none of the teams have a winning record. They play the Pistons twice. They got OKC in there. They got Houston again. So they got some winnable games. And I think that'll push us to mid-January, about 3 weeks before the trade deadline. And then I think the Knicks are going to have to make a decision based on their record, based on the trajectory. Are they buyers? Are they sellers? The other thing is, this is just such a funky, weird season with COVID, that it's going to be really, difficult to kind of determine where you are. Do you want to sneak into the playoffs? Do you want to try to, fight for a higher lottery seed? But with the disincentive to tank, in the NBA nowadays, I think it's one of those situations where the Knicks will attempt. They have Tibbs, who's a win now coach. I assume Leon Rose and company don't want to, start going down the path of a long rebuild, just because it hasn't worked for so many different teams. So I think they'll probably try to play the middle, if I had to guess now. But again, I think so much of it depends on this next, 10, 12, 14 games, where the Knicks should really get a feel of where they are. in terms of, do they have a chance to, finish with the top 6 record in the East this year, maybe win a couple playoff games, maybe shock a team and get into the second round, something along those lines. But the way they play defensively this year doesn't lead you to believe that's the case. But again, I think, after, around the 40 game mark, we'll be about halfway through the season, and that'll really give us a better sense of, what direction the Knicks are headed. Not only this season, but that they consider trading Randall if a team wants him at February. So there's just a lot of interesting questions up in the air.
Yeah, there's a lot of intriguing arguments for a Lillard trade. Obviously, New York would be a great market for his rap career,
Yeah.
and it'd be his franchise in many ways, like Portland is right now. He would take over as the man in the city, like Melo was immediately. That's the kind of big fish that they've been waiting for. What does the deal look like? Is anything and everything on the table if that ultimately becomes available? Is Randall heading to Portland? Is RJ certainly going to be a centerpiece in that kind of deal, I would imagine. But is there going to be anything left after the Lillard trade, I guess is what I'm getting at.
That's the good question, and a lot of Knicks fans don't want Lillard for that reason. I'm more of the belief that I'm just a believer in Dame. I think he's one of the best players in the league right now. Certainly one of the better point guards of our generation. He's that good. He's that much of a difference maker. We know he can handle the spotlight. He's played incredibly well in the playoffs. Has hit big shot after big shot. As many clutch, amazing game winners as any player in the league since he entered the NBA. So I would be of the belief that it's worth the investment, to put RJ and draft picks on the table. If Portland's willing to go that route, you have to draw a line somewhere. My assumption is Portland's going to ask for Barrett, Grimes, Quickley,
Quickley will be missed.
They're looking. They're going to look for everybody because that they have the leverage in that situation. So the Knicks would have to draw a line somewhere, and at some point, because as you mentioned, if Dame comes back and you got Dame and Randall and nobody else, then it's just not going to work. Then you got a point guard who's going to be 31 next season, that doesn't have the surrounding pieces. And then the question, rightfully so, Knicks fans are going to ask themselves, what's the difference between the Knicks, sans, Barrett and all those other pieces, Quickley, et cetera, and with Dame Lillard, than Portland with Dame Lillard. And they have CJ McCollum and Nurkic and some other quality pieces around them, and they're still 5-6 games under 500. The East is getting better, so it's just Dame, as we know, as was reported last week, he wants another $50 million tacked on to his already $75 million left. So it's a real interesting conversation.
Yeah, and you talk about the East getting better. The top teams in the East have all made that consolidation trade, whether it's Harden, Drew Holiday, and certainly it's worked for all those teams. Chicago, too, getting Vucevic and DeRozan in there. So that's probably what it takes to boost you up with the upper echelon. That's how I feel about the Celtics, too. I mean, ultimately, push comes to shove, I'd be interested in Lillard, too, and I'd think somewhat about giving up Jaylen Brown in that circumstance. It'd be such a tough call, though. I mean, Lillard's better right now. Brown's 24 and gets better every year. There's going to be a tough argument on that one if it ultimately comes. Real quickly, where do you see Lillard ending up?
I think he stays in Portland. He just seems so invested.
For his whole career.
I think so. I think if he doesn't get moved here or the next year, then why not? I think he's just going to try to stay long term. If I were him, I'd want to go to a team like Philadelphia or Boston or a situation where I can kind of come in and be the difference maker on a team that wins a championship. I'd love to see Dame get deep in the playoffs, just because I love watching the dude play. I'd love to see him end up in New York, at the right price and kind of take the Knicks that next step. There's few players Jaylen Brown's a special young player, still young, still improving. But again, if you have the opportunity to get Dame Lillard, I think that's the type of move you got to pull the trigger on.
You would do Brown for.
I would. I understand why Celtics fans would be hesitant to do it, and some wouldn't want to. But I think just nothing's promised. If you have an opportunity to pair Dame Lillard, who's a top 10 NBA player, with Tatum, who, is right on that border. They're both right on that fringe, 10, 12, 8, however you want to break it down. You get two elite players on the same team. Brad Stevens can kind of tinker around the edges. Then you have a real chance to become one of the elite teams in the league. That's when you can kind of bring in those guys that will settle for less, whether it's a PJ Tucker signing for a mid-level deal, or, just kind of round out the pieces. So as much as respect as I have for Jaylen Brown, I think if that opportunity presented itself at Boston, I think that would be hard for them to pass up.
Going to be a lot of talk in the next month or so, month and a half here. Last question I have for you, Tommy, before we get you out here. I'm going to get silly with the trade talk here. This is one I've been cooking this up because there are reports that the Celtics might take calls on Dennis Schroder. He's obviously in an interesting contract situation where Celtics can't really re-sign him for much. Most teams above the cap can't either. So he's a pure rental for whoever's going to pick him up. And who knows where that ends up. There's a chance Boston could keep him possibly, but I'm definitely looking at moving him as he plays well here and his value is probably a little bit higher. The Knicks are a team I look at that needs some point guard play here toward a stretch run. I don't know if the Knicks are in the market for kind of a medium deal like that one, just kind of a lateral move, but one that might help them. Certainly that's what Rose was last year, and it helped them significantly. And they also may be in a more flexible situation with the hard cap and things like that to sign him for 9-10 million. Who knows? But I was thinking,
who you want?
Kemba back to Boston, Schroder to New York, but the Knicks are sending their first round pick this year.
Yeah, it's not a crazy trade. If the Knicks were, 5 games over 500 as opposed to 5 games under 500, I think that's something that they would consider. Because Schroeder's good. We know he's talented. He just got caught in a bad situation, whether it's financial advice from his agent, whatever the case might be. We know he made a huge mistake in turning down that Lakers extension. The Knicks have first round picks to play with. They have 5 over the next 7 years. I think that they would. I don't think that they would make that deal. I just don't think Schroder is worth the investment of a first round pick, because what's their upside with Schroder? Is it the second round at best?
But you also get off. Is there an onus on getting off Kemba's deal?
I don't think so. It's one of those things. If they need it, heaven forbid they needed to, sign and extend them, waiving use the. Where they could spread the deal out over 3 years.
Stretch them, yeah.
Stretch, if they had to stretch him, they could go that route. He only has 1 year of guaranteed money left after this season, and it's around $8 million. So it's not like that's a cap killing, situation. The Knicks were entered the season, 10 plus million under the cap this year for the last couple of years. So they've had plenty of money to play with. So I don't think, and again, Kemba's a type of guy where it's not like it's a John Wall contract or one of those, those cap killers.
Yeah, for sure.
If they needed a veteran team, if the Lakers wanted Kemba, at the deadline next year, or just to bring him in, he's a veteran. He's not going to cause trouble. Great teammate. Everyone loves him. Credit to Kemba, by the way, for cheering on the guys. If you notice his body language from the bench, even when he got benched, he was cheering on Quickley and Rose and those guys. So he's the type of guy you want in your locker room. Great player, great presence. So I don't think it's one of those situations where the Knicks are desperate. If the Celtics were willing to take back Fournier's contract or something along those lines, then it's a little bit of a different story. But I don't think the Knicks are aggressively looking to get rid of Kemba.
I actually wanted Fournier back. I'm one of the few, and the deal got high. The 4th year was non-guaranteed, which I thought was wow. The production's just been so horrible, and you can't match that money now in a trade. So they are just completely stuck there. And now you do kind of see why the Celtics didn't really engage on him there at all.
I certainly was surprised the Celtics didn't. I thought it was a very fair trade from a Knicks perspective, being only when it was 4 years. I was a little, but the 3 years with the team option, I thought it'd be fine. But it certainly doesn't look like.
What's wrong with him?
He just has not got on track offensively. Whether it's sharing the ball with Randall. He's missed a lot of shots that he's made in Orlando, that he made in Boston. You guys saw him; he came in and played well outside of a few random, bad performances.
0 games. Yeah, it was baffling his tenure here between the COVID 2-0 4 games and then 2 7 of 11 games from 3. It was like, whoa, we got every part of the spectrum here.
And that's kind of where he's been. That's a scene. You talked about opening night. Dude scored 35 points to beat the Celtics on opening night for the Knicks, and it's really kind of all been down. He's had some moments here and there. He scored 23 on Thursday. I personally believe that the Knicks wouldn't trade him for now just because they're selling low. Obviously, they'd have to give away assets just to get rid of the contract. So that wouldn't make any
Mm.
sense. And he's a decent player. He's a good track record. Played well for France over the summer in the Olympics. So I expect him to bounce back. He's going to get a hot streak at some point sooner rather than later. But it's not just offensively. He hasn't played well defensively. It has been a bad mix with Randall. That first unit's been horrible. So we'll see how it plays out. But I am of the belief that he's it's almost he's bound. His track at the back of his baseball card tells us that he's going to get a little bit better. Kind of aggress to the mean. So we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, it's certainly been a disappointment. As for most of the Knicks, been a disappointing first few months.
I love Tommy Beer shedding optimism that we'll see Kemba in Boston tonight. That one makes this one a lot more interesting. Love the name, love the shirt, love the New York accent. This is just a great podcast appearance here. And I do have to point people toward your coverage of the Knicks here. What's on Tap? The newsletter on Substack covering the Knicks, among other things. At Tommy Beer is where you find him and that newsletter. If you want to plug it real quickly, what people can get there in that newsletter, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. I actually just launched it last week, so we're kind of at the start of this thing, but I would be happy to stop on by, take a look at it. We're gonna have a podcast coming up, and yeah, at Tommy Beer on Twitter. Find all my stuff there, links to the podcast and the newsletter and all that stuff.
Knicks fans, I love them. I love the rivalry. I'll be back at the Garden January 6th, which is that was my first time at the Garden. It was all it lived up to be. From the ninth floor down, the fuck Boston chants. I was like, oh, geez, better not wear this here. But it was fun. Tonight's game should be fun. I like the team. I hope they can get back on their feet. And listen, players notice that playoff series with the Hawks last year and the amount of noise. Those were the first games with crowds out of the
Yes.
COVID pandemic there. So that's still something the Knicks have going for them in terms of appeal around the league. It almost reminds me of when, Al Horford saw the optimism in the Boston crowd and the energy around that Isaiah team before he joined them. Kevin Durant gave them a look based off that. That stuff matters.
Yeah.
And Tibbs, we'll see if he survives. There's certainly a lot of frustration with him and the way he's handled this Kemba situation, criticism from Kenny Smith, Jamal Crawford, and the like. So a little bit of bad energy around the team as well. We'll see where it ultimately ends up. Tommy Beer will be covering it all at Tommy Beer. Like I said, thank you for being here on Dome Theory.
Appreciate you. Be good.